here it is. Faster. Build the best products for people.
The way he does things, it's just different.
Nobody else is doing it.
Macintosh is for the rest of us.
Impossible, possible.
Today, Apple is going to reinvent the phone.
Change the world.
Macintosh.
What a computer is to me is the most remarkable tool that we've ever come up with.
Stay hungry, stay foolish. Thank you all very much.
Steve Jobs was a creative, visionary genius, changing and departing this world before his time. He was a father, husband, and much-loved friend. To the rest of us, he leaves his stamp as one of the greatest innovators and geniuses of our generation.
So he'll be remembered in so many different ways.
He's an absolute pioneer.
One of the most influential people on the media in the last 20 or 30 years.
From the first Mac to groundbreaking iPhones, iPads, and iPods, even Woody and Buzz Lightyear, Jobs changed technology and entertainment in a way not seen since Tomas Edison illuminated the world. He radicalized communication methods and the industry, successfully marketing his inventions so that every man, woman, and child would be proud to label themselves as an Apple fanatic.
I think what Apple's done is just genius.
A techno-marketing genius.
Decades from now, will his contributions still be relevant?
He's a visionary leader, 20 years advance of what the people are using now.
It is time to delve into the life of Steve Jobs, the man who gave his all, but lost the one battle he couldn't win.
Stay hungry, stay foolish.
Stephen Paul Jobs was born in San Francisco, California on February 24th, 1955. His biological parents, unwed college graduates Joanne Simpson and Abdul Fattah Jandali, gave him up for adoption to a loving middle-class couple from the South Bay Area, Paul and Clara Jobs. There was one condition. As his birth parents were unable to continue their college education, they insisted that little Stephen must one day complete his. Young Steve grew up in a valley of apricot orchards that was already turning into the world center of computer technology, Silicon Valley. It was not uncommon to see engineers fill their garages with all kinds of electronic devices in that part of California. Steve Jobs was fascinated by these, and that's why in 1969 he met a computer whiz kid who shared his interest in electronics, Stephen Wozniak, commonly known as Woz. Steve and Woz quickly became friends, even though Woz was 5 years older.
Oh, my first memory was I had designed a computer and was building it in a garage down the street with a friend, and he said, you have to meet this other guy. He went to our high school, and his name is Steve Jobs, and he understands digital electronics, and he also plays pranks at the high school, which I was famous for. So Steve came over, and we met on the sidewalk, as I remember, and we just started asking each other, what'd you do? What pranks did you do? And I would tell which ones I did, and then what'd you do? You know, what have you done with electronics? And he built this, and I've designed all these computers, and we just hit it off. And then we merged into other topics that young people are into.
When Steve Jobs reached college age, he decided he would go to Reed College in Oregon. It was an expensive liberal arts college, way too pricey for his modest parents. But they had to keep their promise to Steve's biological mother, and therefore paid for the tuition. Steve only stayed at Reed for one semester, though, after which he dropped out. He didn't leave the campus completely, just attended the classes which piqued his interest. Without a dorm room, he spent many nights on the floors of his friends' rooms, returned Coke bottles for a 5-cent refund, and ate his meals at the Hari Krishna Center. He then spent a lot of time learning about Eastern mysticism and adopted strange diets, fasting or eating only fruits. He even traveled to India with a friend to seek enlightenment at age 19, which stayed with him throughout his years.
I think that Steve was a fantastic figurehead and a fantastic visionary, but I also think that he was a really smart businessman. And a really smart businessman knows how to create a sustainable business that doesn't need them to operate. And I think Steve Jobs has done that.
After Steve came back to the Valley, he focused on Woz's work on a computer board. Woz, a founding member of Homebrew Computer Club, had an idea of designing his own computer. It was only a circuit board at the time, but it had potential. Jobs noticed that quite a few folks were interested in his friend's brilliant work, and suggested they sell the board. Apple was born.
And I was out trying to peddle PC boards one day and walked into a bike shop, the first bike shop in Mountain View. And Paul Terrell, the then owner of the bike shop, said he would like to take 50 of these computers. And I saw dollar signs in front of my eyes. But he had one catch, which was that he wanted them fully assembled and tested, ready to go, which is a new twist. So we spent the next 5 days on the phone to distributors and convinced the electronics parts distributors around here to give us about $10,000 worth of parts on thin air, just on enthusiasm. So we got the parts and we built 100 computers and we sold 50 of them for cash, and in 29 days paid off the distributors. And that's how we got started.
He recognized that what I had was really incredible, and he said, let's start a little company.
He didn't have the technical skill of Wozniak, but he had the networking skills and the people skills to get the little enterprise off the ground.
And when we first started Apple, he would often pose very good questions. Why isn't a company organized this way? Why doesn't a certain person do a certain job rather than another person do it?
His vision was to take these devices and make them into consumer products, and so to do that, they had to be simplified.
He simplified it in the way that he believed it should work, because one of his famous lines is, it's not about expanding something or making something look better, it's about making something feel better.
We had absolutely no idea what people were going to do these things when we started out. Matter of fact, the two people it was designed for was Woz and myself, because we couldn't afford to buy a computer kit on the market. So we liberated some parts from Hewlett-Packard and Atari, and worked on the design for about 6 months and decided that we would build our own computer.
Apple's first year started in Steve's garage. They assembled boards and drove them over to local computer stores to garner sales. Meanwhile, Woz worked on a new, much improved computer, the Apple II, finished in 1977. Both knew Apple II was the breakthrough computer, far advanced than anything on the market. Steve immediately set out to find venture capitalists that would buy into the project and expand the product into the marketplace. After quite a search, a deal was made with Mike Markkula, an enthusiastic former Intel executive. Markkula's $250,000 investment into the business was a hope that their company would enter the Fortune 500 list sometime in the future, though Mike predicted only 2 years. Mike was right. The Apple II soon became the symbol of personal computing revolution worldwide. It crushed all competition, both because of its breakthrough hardware features, including its color graphics and its very large supply of compatible software.
We're just starting to get glimmerings of where it's going to go. As an example, how many of you use VisiCalc? Quite a few of you. At Apple, every secretary now has an Apple on his or her desk. And they're doing all the word processing on them. You got to give them credit for that, given the software that's out. And they're doing a tremendous amount of financial modeling on the thing.
The key to Apple II's success was actually VisiCalc, the first spreadsheet program ever brought to the market. Thousands of people bought Apple IIs just to use it. As a result, the company grew at a very fast rate and went public after just 4 years of existence. In December 1980, Steve Jobs' net worth passed the 200 million mark on that day at age 25. But there was a threat to Apple's success. Industry giant IBM had its own plans to enter the personal computing market in the early 80s. Apple had to fight back or they would go out of business in a couple of years' time.
IBM wants it all and is aiming its guns on its last obstacle to industry control, Apple. Will Big Blue dominate the entire computer industry, the entire information age?
I mean, they had an advert sort of during the Super Bowl. This is back in like 1984, whatever it was. That advert, as a PR, is one of the adverts that you look at as something that caused huge inspiration, not for the product, but just as a general PR strategy. And he's always managed to maintain that throughout the launches of new products. And that's what he's been good at. He's been good at, I mean, even the latest advert, I think it says, if you don't have an iPhone, you don't have an iPhone, is almost telling you, well, if you don't have one, you're missing out. Yeah, so he's making you sit, you're watching an advert thinking, I don't need it, but I want it. and that's been one of the huge keys to his successes.
They released a series of adverts targeting their originality and IBM's lack of creativity and controlling hand on consumers. Unfortunately, the Apple III computer had already bombed on the marketplace. In turn, Apple II focused all their energy on a project headed by Steve Jobs' Lisa, named after his girlfriend's daughter. The Lisa computer was a breakthrough because it used graphical user interface instead of a command line interface. This technology, like many others that would revolutionize computing, was invented at Xerox PARC. But Apple was the first company to bring it to market.
But Steve Jobs absolutely understood his audiences and understood exactly what they wanted and created devices that were no longer tailored to just business users, were incredibly easy to use for the consumer and that the consumer wanted to use. So he took technologies that were maybe already around but gave them mass appeal through things like touch screens and ready internet access, and I think that has really helped Apple to get its foothold there as the smartphone brand or the tablet brand, despite not being the first. I believe he was very difficult to work with, but I had tremendous admiration for him.
Steve Jobs was a brilliant man, but not known for being well-mannered. He demanded the best out of everyone, and that didn't make him popular. Jobs was soon removed from the Lisa project because he was considered to be too temperamental a manager. Deeply angry, he took revenge by taking over a small project called Macintosh, determined to make it a cheaper GUI computer that would cannibalize sales of Lisa. Macintosh was in development since 1979, and its concept was, quote, a computer as easy to use as a toaster.
From us in the industry, we'll remember him for the Mac, the Apple Mac. In 1980-odd, when that thing came out in the early 80s, was, you know, a real industry first of a personal computer made for personal use rather than corporate use, if you understand what I mean.
He recruited brilliant young engineers in his Mac team and invigorated them by infusing a spirit of entrepreneurship and rebellion, calling them pirates, unlike the rest of the company, the Navy. Even though the Mac project was controversial as it threatened both Apple II and Lisa, aside from Steve Jobs antagonizing the rest of the company, it soon became crucial to Apple's future because Lisa proved yet another market failure.
Is this the ultimate office computer?
Today,
Steve was fully supported in his mission by friend John Sculley. Sculley, Apple's CEO, was personally chosen by Jobs in 1983 to help him run the company and groom him into a top executive.
I said, Steve, I'm not going to come to Apple. I'm going to stay at Pepsi. And he looked down at his running shoes and paused for about 15 seconds and then looked up at me. And he said, you want to sell sugar water for the rest of your life? Or do you want to come with me and change the world?
In January 1984, they launched Macintosh to great fanfare. Although Mac's first months were encouraging, sales soon started to plummet. There was a growing fear in the company that this third flop in a row would put Apple out of business. Besides, Steve Jobs' continued arrogance drove the troops to a point of exhaustion, starting with CEO John Sculley. After a failed board coup initiated by Jobs in mid-1985, Sculley announced that he and the directors had agreed on a new ORG chart for Apple, in which Steve had no say whatsoever. He was only to remain chairman of the board. Steve was shocked. Apple was his life.
And then I got fired. How can you get fired from a company you started?
Looking back, it probably didn't make sense to push out the founder who was the visionary and knew how to build the products. And here I am, the out there, knowing nothing prior to joining Apple about computers.
He helped create it, and he was kicked out. Instead of falling into a state of Great Depression, he started traveling around looking for new ways to spend his energy. It was actually in that second half of 1985 that he was introduced to a small team of brilliant computer graphic experts that George Lucas was trying to sell. They all shared a common dream of making animated movies with computers. Steve was interested, and he eventually bought the company for $10 million in 1986, incorporating it as Pixar.
I think that he is an absolute pioneer. He revolutionised not just the technology industry, which is what he's known for, but the music world, the movie worlds, the telephone worlds. I mean, you name it. He really took what was already there and just made it better.
The investment in Pixar may have been substantial, but his main passion was still to make great computers. In September 1985, he announced to Apple powers that be that he was going to head a new company.
And I had the most delightful conversation with some 4- and 5-year-olds. They probably know as much about the computer as I do, maybe more. And they're totally fluent in it, and they're very much at home in it, and they beat me in most of the games in it. And it was really quite an experience because we always talk about all these things happening sort of at the intellectual, verbal level, but actually got a chance to see 20 students interacting with these computers on a one-on-one basis. And I couldn't help remembering my own school days when none of these things existed and we just get into trouble all the time.
The goal for NEXT was to build an advanced computer for higher education and scientific research. He wasn't going to leave Apple empty-handed. He took with him some of the best engineers and salesmen from the Mac team. Apple disapproved and threatened to sue him. It was at that point Steve left his company for good and sold almost all his stock in disgust.
He stuck to his guns. He said, "This is what I want. This is what I believe the world needs," and he pioneered, and he made it happen. Where a lot of people would have stopped at the first, second, third, with in his case 5th, 6th, 7th hurdle.
But in some sad sort of way of belonging kind of thing, it is quite nice to have Mac products scattered throughout your life. My wife thinks I'm an idiot for this, because I actually have a little Mac logo somewhere in my office at home stuck on the wall, and she works in marketing and she thinks I'm just some brand sucker. But it reassures me in a difficult world.
I think they utilise technology for everyone's advantage. I think that's the important part, because it's very easy just to adapt on what was already out there, and what you see at the moment with changes in technology. It's more of adaptation, where he said, "I want to make something completely different."
NEXT started work on its computer in early 1986, immediately after Apple dropped its lawsuit. Steve aimed at the highest possible standards for his new machine. The best hardware, built in the world's most automated factory and running the most advanced software possible. He decided the computer's operating system, Next Step, would be based on the Unix, the most robust and most complex system in the world. However, it would be as easy to use as a Macintosh, thanks to its own graphical user interface. In addition, software development would become a breeze with its object-oriented programming technology. These ambitious plans put off the release date of the computer, causing a delay in the release of the NEXT Cube. As groundbreaking as it was, the NEXT Cube simply didn't sell. A bit too pricey and an absence of useful software, NEXT struggled for years. All aspects of its sale were approached by expanding its target from just education to businesses and introducing a cheaper box, the NEXT Station. Yet the number of computers sold each month remained only in the hundreds. The company was bleeding money.
There were products that Apple released that failed spectacularly, but Steve Jobs never gave up, and he always went straight back.
Soon, most lost hope and left one after another, including the first outside investor, Texan billionaire Ross Perot. By 1993, NEXT had to close its hardware business and focus only on promoting its advanced software technology. The NEXT software, far from beating Apple, had turned into a niche software development business. All this left Steve devastated. To add to his stress, his investment in Pixar seemed to be in vain. The small company had tried to sell advanced graphic workstations to specialized markets ever since its inception, without success. Jobs was forced to shut down Pixar's hardware operations in 1990, deciding to focus on developing an advanced 3D language called RenderMan. He kept the animation division, headed by John Lasseter, due to its workload on TV commercials, which happened to be one of the company's only source of revenue. during these bleak times, there was a ray of hope. A contract with Disney was in the works to make a full feature film with Pixar in 1991. But by the end of 1993, the contract was cancelled by the mouse. With both his ventures failing, Steve had reached the rock bottom point of his career. The depression caused him to spend most of his days at home with his young son Reed and his wife Lorene, whom he had married in 1991. However, later Jobs would describe this part of his life as an opportunity rather than a failure.
There's some great lessons from Apple that are extraordinary for anyone that works in business. In some respects, it is the single-minded focus that was exemplified in Steve Jobs that showed that you can have a vision and a single-minded vision of what you're going to try and achieve, and to a large extent ignore detractors who would say, you know, it's not necessarily going to work or it's not the right way, but just have the faith in that vision to keep plowing on. There's a famous speech from Steve Jobs at the kind of 2005 inauguration speech at Stanford, in which one of the themes that he talks about is about joining the dots. And I think he makes a very interesting observation, which is sometimes you're doing things you're not quite sure how they're going to come together, and it's only when you look back that you realise how the dots join to actually bring something to fruition. And I think that's a great lesson actually for the world that we live in today, because it's so fast moving. It's sometimes impossible to have a clear vision on exactly how things are going to turn out. But if you're constantly striving to make things better, and you almost have a belief that the job is never done, then you're always going to be driving forward to try and improve your product and create something that is even better than it is today.
And the same thing is now happening in the video sector, as Apple is again transforming the way people use and interact with videos, the way they share video content, and the way they consume it. Apple has fundamentally changed the way the world consumes media, and I think that any brand that isn't influenced by that is not going to stick around for very long.
All hope was not lost with Disney's movie-making idea. Fortunately, as John Lasseter came back to Disney with an improved script for the feature film called Toy Story, the project got back on track.
Wow, cool! Let's go tomorrow, guys!
Red alert! Andy is coming upstairs! Andy's coming, everybody! Back to your places! Hurry! Did you see where he is? Cut him away!
The movie would be released for Thanksgiving 1995. As the date approached, Steve Jobs realized what an incredible power the Disney brand was. He decided Pixar would go public the week after the release of Toy Story, cashing in on the media hype surrounding the first computer-generated animation movie of all time. It worked wonders.
Whoa! Hey, a laser! It's not a laser. It's a little light bulb that blinks. What's with him? Laser and big guys. Come on.
Toy Story's box office success was only surpassed by the Pixar's stock success on Wall Street. Steve Jobs, who owned 80% of the company, saw his net worth rise to over $1.5 billion. 5 times the money he had ever made at Apple in the 1980s. The young entrepreneur was back on the market and making waves. Over at Apple, that boat was sinking. The fruit company, which made computers for the masses, was in the midst of its worst year ever, taking a beating from none other than the Gates gang. After the release of Windows 95, the Mac, which turned profitable but which had failed to evolve for a decade while Steve Jobs was away, started losing market share at an alarming rate. By 1996, the company's newly appointed CEO, Gil Amelio, was looking for new software to replace the old and bloated Mac OS. After much thought, he eventually chose Steve's next step, believing that if anyone could turn it around, it would be Jobs.
I think the original idea was that Apple would try to use Steve Jobs. And that was a naive idea, that you think that you can be the one to take advantage of Steve Jobs. That's not how it works with Steve Jobs. You are not going to be the person who's taking advantage of him.
When Steve came back, he knew exactly what to do. He canceled the licensing agreements and took it right back to the way it was when he was running Apple.
Gates saw this as an immediate threat and tried to stop the plan in any way he could, calling Amelio many times. No one listened, and Apple paid $400 million to acquire Next. Before he knew it, Jobs was back at the company that had thrown him out a decade earlier, with welcoming arms, even though his official title was that of, quote, informal advisor to the CEO. But when Emilio announced Apple's losses of $700 million for the first quarter of 1997, the board decided it was time to get rid of this terrible manager. Steve Jobs organized a board coup and was named interim CEO of Apple in July 1997. He immediately started an extensive review of the whole company, cutting the number of projects from hundreds to just a dozen. The number of hardware products would be cut down to just 4. However, there was a shocking announcement on the horizon. At Macworld, Jobs made a shocking announcement. He and his arch-rival Bill Gates would be joining forces in an unprecedented deal that would put an end to all patent disputes. Though these two powerhouses are similar in their attack to business, their approach to charity is different. Gates had contributed a substantial portion of his assets to charities around the world. With Jobs, all acts of philanthropy were a private matter. Under Jobs, Apple signed to participate in Product Red program, producing red versions of devices to give profits from sales to charity. Apple became the single largest contributor since then. The chief of the Product Red project, singer Bono, cited Jobs saying there was nothing better than the chance to save lives when he initially approached Apple with the invitation to participate in the program.
The Think Different campaign was an attempt to not only tell the world that Apple's core values are back, but to inspire the employees to create the kinds of things Steve wanted them to be.
I think anyone that runs a brand has to be good at putting a spin on things, because not everything always goes well. You know, the iPod, the iPhone, everything that he's launched has always had a negativity. So you've got to be able to put the bad things right, whether it's making the design better or it's just explaining to someone the reasons why they need something that they don't always need. And I think Apple were very good at that, because Apple as a company, I mean, they've done phenomenally well, but they've also done well for the one reason of telling people you don't need this, but you want it. And they're very clever with their advertising in the way they do that. And I think I mean, the advertising for them has probably been their lead successor.
Steve Jobs quickly restored confidence back to the Apple community. The company launched a revolutionary marketing campaign around a new slogan, Think Different. It spread the idea that people who bought an Apple were revolutionary thinkers that changed the world. As the brand grew stronger, the company was quick to launch a series of new products. They included the Power Mac G3 and the PowerBook. These were not only powerful, but revolutionized the world of film and television editing, adding Final Cut Pro to the package. Making TV and film just got a bit easier. Only 6 months after his return, and Jobs had led his company out of the red and into the black. Yet Apple's domination on the market came a bit later.
The iMac itself is getting rave reviews, and I'm almost wondering whether the demand for the machine, which seems very strong, whether you have enough machines to meet it.
Right. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, we're making a lot of them, but we're going to find out since the iMac goes on sale this Saturday, tomorrow, across the U.S. And in about 2 weeks in Europe and Japan, we're going to find out what the real demand is, and it could exceed lots. So we don't know yet.
Determined to make his mark on the home computing front, Steve gave birth to a jaw-dropping consumer desktop computer. Enter the iMac. Introduced in May 1998, it was Apple's first really innovative product since the original Macintosh in 1984. The iMac's stunning, translucent design blew away the entire personal computer industry, which only produced black or beige boxes with power cords for over a decade. Not only did you have your choice of hot colors, but it was all located in one place. iMac was a hot seller. Design innovations continued through 1998 and 1999 with the colored iMacs and iBook, Apple's consumer notebook.
Our mission statement is to just make some great computers that can really make a difference to people. I mean, the iMac, you can take an iMac home, take it out of the box, and be cruising the internet in 10 minutes. You know, try that on a PC, you're talking more like an hour. So I think what we want to do is make some great products and then tell people about them. And I think tell people about them in an intelligent, witty, kind of fun way. And hopefully the ad campaign that breaks this Sunday on Wonderful World of Disney starts to do that.
When he finally accepted the role of full-time CEO of Apple in January 2000, he became the first man to hold the CEO position of two public companies at the same time. With all these innovations, the first reason for Jobs' return to Apple had not yet materialized. After all, the plan was to bring NeXT software technology to the Mac platform. This eventually happened in early 2001 as Apple released the first version of its breakthrough operating system, Mac OS X. Mac OS X was really next step with a Mac facade. However, it became an essential asset as the company developed several breakthrough applications as part of the digital hub strategy. This strategy was a vision for the future of the personal computer. Many analysts and self-appointed experts proclaimed that the personal computer would eventually become a thing of the past. Due to the birth of the internet, our home computers would fade into the background.
I think that the way brands communicate with their end users is incredibly strongly influenced by Apple, by devices such as the iPad or the iPhone, which were pretty revolutionary. The iPhone wasn't the first smartphone, the iPad wasn't the first tablet. They were the first to really take off and create a new way of interacting with the media among consumers and businesses. And by doing that, Apple was able to force the media industry to completely change its way of operating.
We deal with our products every day, and they affect the way that we even think about how we work with our clients and market to consumers. And that's just, great products, whether it's the Mac or the iPod or the iPhone. They've affected us all in terms of the way that we are as consumers, really, particularly in the kind of work that we do.
However, the powers that be at Apple believed they would instead evolve into digital centers for hubs for new digital lifestyles.
Just from his background, he utilised everything he loved and put it into one, because we all love our movies, we love our music, we love things that look great, and he literally put all that energy and excitement for what he had for the different industries into a product. And the iMac, the iPod, the iPads, everything kind of symbolises around that.
Quite simply, the computer would be the centerpiece of daily life, complete with digital cameras, camcorders, MP3 players, smartphones, and other digital devices. This belief led Apple to develop a suite of applications designed to manage this new lifestyle.
Because apps are about things being useful, aren't they? I think we could have just put the magazine into an app, so you just flick through the pages. But I think you want something interactive with an app, something that actually gives you a function that you want. So if I'm a banker, say, on a meeting in Cologne, and I'm stuck on my own with a night to kill, I can press this button and get myself a good time.
iApps, which were only compatible with Apple systems, were introduced, including iMovie, iTunes, iDVD, iPhoto, iCal, and iSync, GarageBand, and finally iWeb. The iApps were a strategic move in Apple's greater plan to gain market share over the PC, as there was simply no equivalent solution on the Windows platform. What no one could imagine is that music would play the greatest role in making Apple a market giant.
Right through to the advent of iTunes, which was the first time somebody was able to convince the music industry to distribute their intellectual property in such a way, and that revolutionized the music industry. To more recently, the launch of the iPad, which has changed the way the media operates again by forcing the media to operate in a certain way if they wanted to access certain consumers, and that was an enormous body of consumers. The media didn't really have a choice.
Realizing that a desktop video was not as popular as he originally thought, Jobs turned his attention towards digital music. It was a hot item introduced by Napster. However, Apple was behind and desperately needed to catch up.
So yes, there have been some great ad campaigns. The original iTunes campaign is pretty iconic. But in fact, what's marketed Macs is the look. I mean, before they started going into this kind of titanium box and stuff, it was very much white or black, and generally white. and that made them stood out. So it was marketing through product rather than marketing through campaign, which is very clever.
Through a few quick hires, the iPod hit stores just in time for Santa to deliver in 2001. iPod's breakthrough features were simple: slick design, brilliant user interface and click wheel, and its fast FireWire connectivity, allowing it to sync seamlessly with iTunes. It was a #1 on the charts from the start. For the first time, people were buying Macs not just for personal computing, but so they own a tiny music player which could fit in their pocket. Apple cashed in on that success first by making the player Windows compatible and by convincing the record labels to sell their songs on iTunes. By 2006, iTunes and iPod became the undisputed leader of the new digital music era. A significant landmark was passed in 2006 when Apple's revenues from iPod equal those made on computers. For the first time in its history, the firm from tiny Cupertino, California, had left its niche markets to become as influential a player in consumer electronics as Microsoft was in the PC space, with a 75% market share. Interestingly enough, iPod also played a critical role in setting Pixar's future. After having released success after success, A Bug's Life, Toy Story 2, Monsters, Inc., and Finding Nemo, the animation studio had decided to let go of its distribution deal with Disney, mainly because of increasing tensions between Steve Jobs and Disney CEO Michael Eisner. Steve Jobs openly said he would not make another deal with the mouse until Eisner stepped down. Turns out his opinion was shared by many at Disney, including Walt's own nephew, Roy Disney, who started a public campaign to oust the company's CEO. This led to the nomination of Bob Iger as new CEO in March 2005. The Steve Jobs and Bob Iger partnership began with a decision to sell TV shows on its iTunes store. In October 2005, in front of an audience of stunned journalists, the boss of Apple shook hands with the head of the Magical Kingdom, implying a renewed cooperation with Pixar in the near future. This eventually led to no less than the merger of both companies, announced in January 2006. Steve Jobs, who still owned half of Pixar's stock, became Disney's largest individual shareholder. As successful as the iPod was, there would be a couple more releases from the mind of Steve Jobs, which would revolutionize communication and the personal computing industry.
I think every place I've worked has been Mac-based. PCs tend to be used by people in the accounts department, people in sales, anyone designing a magazine, writing for a magazine, broadly will be on a Mac because they do the job best. And they look cool as well.
Facebook and Twitter would not be where they were today if Apple hadn't made it easy and accessible for people to use the internet on the go through devices like the iPad and the iPhone.
2006 was a critical year for Apple in three respects. The first was the success of the Mac. Mac sales were finally taking off, and after years of struggle to gain market share, its growth rate was exceeding that of the PC. Several factors accounted for this historic change. The success of the iPod, of course, and the positive side effect it had on the Apple brand. There was a move to Intel as well, making Macs faster and cheaper. If someone had missed their Windows PC, no problem. Macs were now able to run Windows. But the biggest development appeared in January 2007. The cell phone had evolved quite a bit over many years, from a block the size of a brick to a tiny flip phone which could neatly fit in your purse or briefcase. However, when Steve Jobs introduced iPhone at Macworld, iPhone was arguably the ultimate Apple product. It wasn't just a phone. The iPhone's hardware actually ran Apple's full operating system, OS X. If that wasn't enough, its multi-touch technology, web surfing, and iPod capabilities thrown in with an easy-to-use interface made it a smartphone light years ahead of its competition. It shook the phone industry to its core, down to the exclusive deal that Apple cut with AT&T for subscription plans. 3 years after it was introduced, iPhone went down in history as the first digital convergence device, equivalent to placing a computer, an iPod, and a phone in your pocket. It was such an obvious part of Apple's move outside the PC business that Steve announced that the company's name would be forever changed from Apple Computer Inc. to Apple Inc. The iPhone didn't just break records and introduce a hot mobile phone into the market. its interface and hardware also lent a hand to disabled individuals who could now communicate with ease. The success was not without some drama. The so-called backdating scandal hit Silicon Valley when the practice was exposed by a Wall Street Journal article in 2006. Apple swiftly hired lawyers to lead an internal investigation of its own records. Though they found irregularities, he was cleared the following year as the SEC found he had no idea of the legal or accounting implications of the matter. The scandal was significant in the sense that it raised the issue of Apple's future without Steve Jobs, perhaps a foretelling of the future as Jobs' health problems came to the forefront. In late 2003, Steve was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. It was discovered that his tumor was not of the deadly type. All believed that through a surgery everything would now be okay. However, in 2008, people started commenting heavily on Steve being increasingly thinner. Although he denied that there was a serious problem, Apple announced to a surprised audience that the CEO would not go on stage for the last Macworld keynote in history. In fact, Jobs had to take 6 months leave as he was awaiting a liver transplant. The whole story of Steve's cancer raised many a discussion about a public company's necessary transparency regarding its CEO's health, especially when that CEO is as essential to its market value as Steve Jobs is to Apple's. With cancer and the liver transplant out of the way, 2010 saw the rebirth of Steve Jobs as a very active CEO. In sharp contrast with 2009, he came back on stage for many Apple events that year and surprised the world many times over with incredibly innovative Apple products. The computing world had long discussed the production of a tablet computer, and naturally, Apple was the first to introduce one. The iPad was released to the public with mass hysteria, long lines, excitement, the whole 9 yards. Much like its predecessors, iPod and iPhone, everyone had to have one. At the industry conference D8 in June 2010, Steve Jobs clearly stated that in his opinion, iPad started the post-PC era, and that PCs would eventually become like trucks, a marginal part of the market dominated by portable tablets. If this comes true, this one-man Steve Jobs will have played a crucial part in both giving birth and putting an end to the personal computer industry.
Steve Jobs is probably one of the most influential people on the media in the last 20 or 30 years.
Though Steve kept quiet about his health and cancer diagnosis, he opened up to a group of graduates at a Stanford commencement address in 2005. He divulged that he was diagnosed with a rare form of pancreatic cancer the year before, and he was given only a few months to live. However, doctors performed surgery and Steve would soldier on for another 6 years, and his company would release the most groundbreaking technology that ordinary people would experience. He carried on releasing Apple products and models steadily from 2007, and the public knew little of his personal situation. It wasn't until August of 2011 that Apple enthusiasts realized the severity of his illness. When his resignation was announced on August 24, 2011, it was revealed that Tim Cook, Apple's COO, would take over the CEO position vacated by Jobs. It was largely believed that Jobs now had little time left. He famously said he would keep going until he physically couldn't do his job any longer. He was well known as a workaholic and proud of it, even surviving on a vegan diet because he believed it cost him less energy to digest, energy he could spend working on his latest invention. Sadly, though, fans and colleagues knew Steve Jobs' resignation must mean he was in the twilight of his life. Jobs' co-workers released a statement saying that it was Steve's vision and leadership that saved Apple and guided it to its position as the world's most innovative and valuable technology company. After the initial shock of Steve's resignation wore off, the company spent considerable time and resources to silence the rumblings that the top-secret iPhone 4S was ready to be released. Followers were anxious for Apple's next chapter under Tim Cook. But unfortunately, just one day after the iPhone 4S, the fifth model of the iconic phone was announced as a reality, and 6 weeks after his resignation, Steve Jobs passed away in his home in Palo Alto on October 5th, 2011.
I'm George Lewis with this NBC News special report. Apple Incorporated announced tonight that company co-founder and former chief executive Steve Jobs has died at the age of 56. At the company's headquarters in Cupertino, California, tonight the flags have been lowered to half-staff. And a statement said, "We are deeply saddened to announce that Steve Jobs passed away today." Jobs is credited with innovating the Macintosh computer, the iPhone, the iPad, and the iPod. He is survived by his wife and 4 children.
Our main story this morning, Steve Jobs, the man who brought the world the iPod and the iPhone, has died at the age of 56. He'd been ill for several years and had been treated for pancreatic cancer.
He was the co-founder, of course, of the technology giant Apple, but stepped down as chief executive in August because of health problems. Apple's new boss, Tim Cook, said they had lost a visionary and creative genius.
And we call it the iPad.
The official cause of death was said to be respiratory arrest, with the underlying cause being pancreatic cancer. He reportedly died peacefully, surrounded by his family. Shortly after his death was announced, networks interrupted scheduled programming to broadcast the tragic news. Numerous newspapers around the world carried news of his death on their front pages the next day. Several notable people, including U.S. President Barack Obama, British Prime Minister David Cameron, Microsoft founder Bill Gates, and the Walt Disney Company's Bob Iger, commented on the death of Jobs. Other statements of condolences were made by many of Jobs' friends and colleagues, such as Steve Wozniak and George Lucas.
I loved his enthusiasm, his simple delight, often I think mixed with some relief. But that, yeah, we got there in the end, and it was good. You can see his smile, can't you? The celebration of making something great for everybody. Enjoying the defeat of cynicism. The rejection of reason. The rejection of being told 100 times you can't do that. So his, I think, was a victory for beauty, for purity, and as he would say, for giving a damn. He was my closest and my most loyal friend. We worked together for nearly 15 years, and he still laughed at the way I said aluminium. For the past 2 weeks, I think we've all been struggling to find ways to say goodbye. This morning, I simply want to end by saying thank you, Steve.
Both Apple and Microsoft flew their flags at half-staff throughout their respective headquarters and campuses. Bob Iger ordered all Disney properties, including Walt Disney World and Disneyland, to fly their flags at half-staff from October 6th to the 12th, 2011. A small private funeral was held on October 7th, 2011, of which details were not revealed out of respect to Jobs' family. Apple announced on the same day they had no plans for public service, but were encouraging well-wishers to send their remembrance messages to an email address created to receive such messages. A special day was given to honor Jobs, as October 16th, 2011 was declared Steve Jobs Day by Governor Jerry Brown of California. On that day, an invitation-only memorial was held at Stanford University. Those in attendance include Apple and other tech company executives, members of the media, celebrities, close friends of Jobs, and politicians, along with Jobs' family. Bono, Yo-Yo Ma, and Joan Baez performed at the service, which lasted longer than an hour. The service was highly secured, with guards at all of the university's gates and a helicopter flying overhead from an area news station. Jobs is buried at Alta Mesa Memorial Park, the only non-denominational cemetery in Palo Alto.
The media reaction to Steve Jobs' death bordered on the messianic and hysterical, didn't it? I mean, it was amazing to realise just how many lives he touched, how valued he was by everyone. I think it's a product of the fact that Macs are used so much by people in the creative industries that literally journalists were devastated.
I wasn't surprised with how people took to that, because Apple's one of those companies that we all love now, and we all are excited and wait for the next product to come along, and we all know that it's come from his head. So I think people are thinking, we love this brand, what's going to happen next? So I think that's what I think. You know, in general, I think people were very saddened by it. But you are when anyone dies. But you know, someone that's has been such an influence to our daily lives, which it has been, I think would definitely make people think.
The response to Jobs' death was more akin to a rock star, a political hero, than a technology whiz. People gathered and put up makeshift memorials outside Apple stores, at his home, and even took their grief to the internet. Apple fans put up pictures and memorial messages on Facebook and even shared personal stories about how Apple changed their lives. Jobs' achievements had truly touched people in all corners of the globe, and now, thanks to his inventions, they were connected. Emotional tributes from world leaders and even his biggest rival poured into the media devices he had helped create. He was responsible for reinventing Apple in the 1990s and making computers chic, cool, and fun. In the early 2000s, Jobs was well on his way to patenting the iPhone's technology and name, even though it would be nearly 7 years before the product reached the masses. His recent accomplishments include 5 wildly successful iPhone models, the revamp of Apple iMac computers, MacBook, and the MacBook Air. Countless other products like Apple speakers, televisions, modems, and accessories, not to mention iTunes and the iPad. Steve Jobs was the man who sought to make his visions a reality, and his resolve towards technical evolution never wavered. The iPhone 4S went on to sell 1 million units in the first 24 hours after it went on sale. It sold 66% more than predicted and will go down in the books as being another Apple success story. Without Steve Jobs, Apple has made it clear they intend to continue in the direction their longtime leader would have wanted, towards revolutionary, eye-catching design, user-friendly operating systems, and adding features that make communication easier and more enjoyable. Visionary, genius, innovator, perfectionist. Steve Jobs was all of these things in all areas of his short life. Growing up, not knowing his own family, Laureen and his children were a priority for Steve, as was his thirst for knowledge. As he told the Stanford class of 2005, what he wanted for himself was to stay hungry and stay foolish. As he hoped for them to start their lives, he ominously spoke about how he knew that imminent death was his reason to live life to the fullest and kept his passion burning bright, professionally and personally. Steve Jobs was deeply devoted to his family, his wife, and his business, leaving millions of fans, friends, and historic moments behind. No doubt he will be missed by his colleagues and competitors alike, and who knows what he would have accomplished given a few more years. There is no way to tell, but what is certain, Steve Jobs changed technology and communication as we know it forever.